You had to add that in, good about entertaining. That was actually a very nice introduction, nicer than the one I gave myself several years ago. I was asked by the National Archives to do double duty running a presidential library at the time in Iowa and taking on the Eisenhower Centenary out in Abilene, Kansas. I guess I should say the other Abilene. And I remember the first time I was introduced to a group about this size, I defined myself as someone who'd been a presidential freak since he was about 6 years old. And the next day's paper ran the headline, "Freak to Run Eisenhower Centenary." True story. Bush was the day before the internet and streaming. We won't talk about my high vote. And he thought of running for the Virginia Assembly. Anyway, in return for your hospitality, this evening I promised to keep in mind some cautionary words of Abraham Lincoln, who said of a long-winded Springfield lawyer that he could compress the most words into the smallest ideas of anyone he knew. The great prairie novelist Willa Cather wrote that the history of every country begins in the heart of a man or woman. This is not a view widely held in the modern classroom, where heroes and villains, for that matter, are out of fashion. And narrative storytelling is often crowded out by statistical analysis. But of course it wasn't a statistic that wrote the Gettysburg Address, or charged up San Juan Hill, or challenged Mikhail Gorbachev to tear down his wall. Individuals matter. If you doubt that, imagine our history without Washington on the balcony of Federal Hall, Lincoln proclaiming emancipation, or Woodrow Wilson crusading for his League of Nations. Visualize the 20th century without John F. Kennedy going to the brink over Soviet missiles in Cuba, or the 21st without George W. Bush, bullhorn in hand, standing atop the smoking ruins of the World Trade Center. And if individuals matter, then individual leaders matter greatly. You need hardly hear from me. Ari will give us a much greater insight into the quadrennial frenzy on which we are all embarked called choosing a president. What tests should voters apply in that process? What criteria should they be guided by? The Constitution, after all, says very little about a president's qualifications. The only legal qualifications it spells out require that one must be 35 years or older, native born, and a resident within the United States for at least 14 years. That's it. Nowhere does our organic charter mention educational background, communication skills, administrative or legislative experience. Nor does it mention personal traits like judgment, compassion, conscience, or that all-purpose resume buster works well with others. These and a host of other factors as well are left to you, the electorate, to weigh, along with your ideological and policy preferences. So does history have anything to contribute as you ponder your decision? We historians, after all, like to think of ourselves as being in the perspective business. On the other hand, of course, we're often criticized for loving the past so much we live in it. When you stop to think the alternative is Charlie Sheen, TMZ, and anyone named Kardashian, that the past is really not such a bad place to live. This evening, for a few minutes, with your permission, I'd like to step back a bit and offer a decidedly non-partisan alternative to the 60-second spots, focus group sound bites, and horse race journalism that passes for the making of the president in 2012. If it's any consolation, negative campaigning's been around since the earliest days of the Republic. So has media bias. Consider the charges leveled by one Connecticut newspaper at Thomas Jefferson in 1800. Should the then Vice President of the United States defeat the incumbent John Adams, it warned, quote, Murder, robbery, rape, adultery, and incest will all be openly taught and practiced. The air will be rent with the cries of the distressed, the soil will be soaked with blood, and the nation black with crimes. In recent years, there's been a heated debate among presidents, politicians, and pundits alike. Does character count? You bet it does. Never more so than when a president is committing young Americans to battle. But how then do we define character? Character, said Lincoln, is like a tree, and reputation like its shadow. The shadow is what we think of it, the tree is the real thing. But consider the tree of conviction. It goes without saying we want our presidents to be men and women of principle. What happens, however, when principles come into conflict with one another? Thomas Jefferson worshipped before the altar of strict constructionism, if no other. Yet history reveres him for putting aside his deepest convictions about limited government when Louisiana came on the market. More precisely, Jefferson's constitutional principles took a backseat to his continental vision of the United States. And most people, presumably especially those west of the Mississippi, think it's a good thing they did. We are routinely told that America's presidents are the most powerful men in the world. In truth, they're often at the mercy of unforeseen events and movements that test their deepest convictions. Richard Nixon was a principled anti-communist, at least until he looked into the 21st century and saw that it was in America's interest to bring China out of its self-imposed isolation. Lyndon Johnson, the first Southern president in 100 years, staked his presidency on principles of racial justice and economic opportunity. He lost his presidency on a principle he may or may not have believed, that America should pursue military victory in Southeast Asia, whatever the cost. One man's idealist is another's ideologue. No president was more principled than Herbert Hoover. Before his election in 1928, Hoover's name was synonymous with American generosity. He was the great humanitarian, the self-made millionaire engineer with offices on 4 continents, living in London, who abandoned his career and his fortune to organize the first great international relief effort in World War I. He would spend 50 years of his life feeding over 1 billion people in 56 different countries. Why is it that that's not what we remember Hoover for? Rather, the Great Depression. If you go to Russia today, or Belgium, or Czechoslovakia, you'll meet Hoover the hero. Hoover the symbol of American compassion, decency, and generosity. In his own land, he's a symbol of the Great Depression. There's a reason for that. He stuck to his principles. The same voluntarism that he believed in, that fed Belgium in World War I, that observed meatless Mondays and wheatless Wednesdays to save food to send to the Allies. The next time you chew sugarless gum, think of Herbert Hoover. It was part of the Food Administration in World War I. The same reliance upon voluntarism from what he said were the most generous people on the face of the earth became a ball and chain once he became president and confronted an international crisis greater than anyone could imagine, himself included. Overnight, the rules changed. No longer was it enough for a president to be a skilled administrator or legislative strategist. In times of distress, he must serve as empathizer-in-chief, a role for which Hoover, of all men, was temperamentally unsuited. He was a Quaker, orphaned at 8, who sat in a cold meeting house waiting for the inner light to come to him. He said, as an old man, that he was 10 years old before he realized he could do something for the sheer pleasure of it without offending the Lord. Not surprisingly, he was not a particularly empathetic figure. His Quaker conscience was muffled by his Quaker reticence. And so the hero of World War I, the man who saved more lives than Hitler, Stalin, and Mao together, wiped out. That man rode to the final rally of his 1932 campaign through crowds of New Yorkers chanting, "We want bread." A successful president combines principle with pragmatism. Harry Truman did not lack for principles. Indeed, he drew more than one line in the sand during the explosive years after World War II, when NATO, the Truman Doctrine, and the Marshall Plan were improvised, all with the help of the so-called do-nothing 80th Congress. In Korea, Mr. Truman redefined the meaning of war and victory themselves. And in firing General Douglas MacArthur, he upheld the principle of civilian rule over the military at no small cost to his short-term popularity. A successful president is as comfortable as was Mr. Truman in his own skin. He used to say, it would be interesting if Moses had stopped in the middle of the desert to take a pole. Calvin Coolidge doesn't seem at first glance like Mr. Truman. Actually, they have a lot in common, including their very healthy attitude toward the temporary stewardship of any president. Coolidge said this: "It is a great advantage to a president and a major source of safety to the country for him to know that he is not a great man."